The chandelier light shimmered above the elegantly decorated tables in New York City's most exclusive event hall. The soft hum of the city's elite mingling blended seamlessly with the gentle strains of a string quartet, creating an atmosphere of opulence and sophistication. Alexander Pierce, a renowned real estate mogul, stood near the entrance, a glass of champagne in hand. His perfectly tailored suit complemented his confident demeanor, yet his eyes, fixed on the hall's grand doors, betrayed a hint of unease. Every detail of this evening had been meticulously planned. The engagement party with Caroline Bennett, heiress to one of America's largest retail chains, was more than just a celebration. It was a statement, a display of success, and, most importantly, an opportunity to prove something, not only to the world, but to one person in particular. That person was Valerie Morgan, his ex-girlfriend. Once the love of his life, Valerie had been his world until their relationship ended abruptly and painfully. Now, Alexander had sent her an invitation to his engagement, not out of politeness, but with a calculated purpose to confront her and perhaps himself. Finally, the grand doors opened, and Valerie entered. The sight of her stopped Alexander's heart for a moment. Valerie looked stunning in an emerald green dress that hugged her figure perfectly. Her auburn hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, but what truly left him speechless was not her beauty. It was the fact that she was unmistakably pregnant. Beside her stood a tall, confident man, his hand resting protectively on hers. Alexander felt the champagne glass slip slightly in his grip as a wave of surprise and indignation crashed over him. This was not part of his plan. "Alexander?" Caroline's voice snapped him out of his trance. She stood beside him, dressed in an exquisite white gown that radiated power rather than romance. Her gaze followed his to Valerie. "Who is she?" "No one that matters," Alexander replied, his voice calm but his eyes still locked on Valerie. Deep down, however, he knew he couldn't have been further from the truth. The hum of conversations in the grand hall grew quieter as Valerie walked in, her steps measured and composed. Alexander couldn't take his eyes off her. The way her green dress flowed, the calm confidence in her stride, even the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, struck him. But what truly consumed his thoughts was the man at her side. Every movement and gesture from the stranger radiated assurance, igniting an unsettling mix of jealousy and confusion in Alexander's chest. Caroline, still by his side, was quick to notice the shift in his demeanor. Her voice, sharp and unrelenting, broke the silence. "Are you going to explain, or should I guess who she is?" Alexander didn't respond right away, his focus glued to Valerie. The way she greeted a few familiar faces, her hand occasionally brushing her rounded belly, painted a picture he wasn't prepared to see. "She's an old acquaintance," he finally muttered, though the words lacked conviction. Caroline raised a skeptical eyebrow. "An acquaintance who clearly has your full attention." "I'm not blind, Alexander." Before he could respond, Valerie turned and locked eyes with him. The intensity of her gaze held him in place. She didn't flinch or look away, her expression calm but unyielding. It was as though she was silently daring him to approach her. For a moment, everything else in the room faded. The music, the guests, even Caroline's growing irritation. Unable to resist, Alexander set his glass down on a nearby table and began walking toward Valerie. She didn't move, nor did the man beside her. When he reached her, the air between them felt charged with unspoken tension. "Valerie," he said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Didn't you? You sent me an invitation, Alexander, and here I am." "Yes, but not like this." His eyes darted toward her stomach, then back to the man beside her. "And who is he?" "This is James," Valerie replied smoothly, her tone neutral but firm. "A good friend." "A good friend?" Alexander repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's all?" Valerie tilted her head slightly, clearly unfazed by his probing. "That's none of your business, Alexander." "And the baby?" The words escaped him before he could stop them. "Is it?" She cut him off, her voice sharp but controlled. "We're not having this conversation here. Not in a room full of strangers." Alexander clenched his jaw. the weight of her words settling over him. "Then tell me when and where, because this conversation isn't over." Valerie studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether he deserved the opportunity. Finally, she reached into her clutch, pulled out a small card and handed it to him. "Tomorrow afternoon, call me and we'll talk." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, James following close behind. Alexander stood there, gripping the card tightly as he watched her disappear into the crowd. What had started as a calculated attempt to assert control had unraveled into something far more complex, leaving him with more questions than answers. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office staring at the small card Valerie had handed him. The number written neatly in her familiar handwriting seemed to taunt him. He had spent the night tossing and turning, consumed by thoughts of her. Every moment they had shared, every argument, every kiss, they all played on a loop in his mind. And now the sight of her, pregnant and with another man, had thrown him completely off balance. Eventually, his resolve hardened. Picking up the phone, he dialed her number. It rang twice before her calm, measured voice came through. "Alexander." "Valerie," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You said to call. When can we meet?" There was a brief pause on the other end. "There's a cafe on West 17th Street. Meet me there at 3 p.m. "I'll be there," he replied, his tone firm. When the time came, Alexander arrived early, choosing a table near the window where he could see the street outside. The cafe was small and unassuming, a stark contrast to the opulence he was accustomed to. It reminded him of the simpler days when they had been together, when money and ambition hadn't yet defined his world. At exactly 3 p.m., Valerie walked in. She wore a simple navy dress, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun. She looked calm, composed, but Alexander could sense the guardedness in her eyes. She approached the table, and he stood to greet her. "Thank you for meeting me," he said as she sat down. "I figured we needed to have this conversation," she replied, placing her bag on the chair beside her. "No point in dragging things out." Alexander studied her face, trying to find a trace of the woman he had once known so intimately. "Valerie, I need to know, is the baby mine?" She met his gaze directly, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Alexander, he's your son." The words hit him like a freight train. He had suspected it, but hearing her confirm it made everything real. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She sighed, leaning back in her chair. "Do you think it was an easy decision? After the way things ended between us? After everything you did or didn't do?" "I didn't know," he said defensively. "If I had—" "You would have what, Alexander?" she interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "Would you have dropped everything to be there? Would you have changed who you were back then? Because I didn't think you would." Her words stung, but he knew she had a point. Back then, his ambition had consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. "I've changed, Valerie," he said, his voice quieter now. "I know I made mistakes, but I want to make things right. I want to be there for you, for our son." She studied him carefully, her gaze piercing. "Words are easy, Alexander. I've heard them before. What I need to see is action." "And you will," he promised. "I'll prove it to you, every single day." For a moment, there was silence between them, heavy with the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. Finally, Valerie nodded. "All right, I'll give you a chance. But know this isn't about us. It's about him. If you want to be part of his life, you'll have to earn it." "I will," Alexander said without hesitation. "I'll do whatever it takes." As they left the cafe, Alexander felt a flicker of hope for the first time in years. It was faint, fragile, but it was enough. Valerie, meanwhile, walked away with cautious optimism, knowing that she was taking a risk. But for the sake of her son, it was a risk she was willing to take. The days following their conversation at the cafe were filled with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Alexander, determined to prove his commitment, began to make subtle but significant changes in his life. He cleared his schedule to ensure he was available, started reading books on parenting, and even reached out to a therapist to work on the emotional walls he had built over the years. For the first time, his life wasn't solely about business or ambition. It was about preparing for something bigger. Valerie, on the other hand, found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. Seeing Alexander again, hearing his promises, and witnessing his determination stirred something inside her. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of their past weighed heavily on her. Trust wasn't something she could freely give, especially not now with so much at stake. One afternoon, Alexander called Valerie and asked to meet again. This time he suggested a park near the neighborhood where they had once lived together. Valerie hesitated, but eventually agreed, feeling that revisiting their old surroundings might provide clarity for both of them. When she arrived, Alexander was already waiting by a bench under the shade of a large oak tree. He looked different, not just in his appearance, but in his demeanor. There was a quiet patience about him, a sense of humility she hadn't seen before. "Thank you for coming," he said as she approached. She nodded, taking a seat beside him. "Why did you choose this place?" He gestured toward the open space in front of them, where children were playing and families were gathered for picnics. "This park was where we used to talk about our dreams, remember? I thought it might remind us of who we were before everything got so complicated." Valerie glanced around, her gaze softening as memories flooded back. She remembered those afternoons when they had sat together on this very bench, dreaming of a future that seemed so simple back then. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she murmured. Alexander turned to her, his expression earnest. "I know I let you down, Valerie. I let us down. But I don't want to live in the shadow of those mistakes anymore. I want to start over. With you. With our son. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away, but I'm asking for a chance to prove myself." Valerie's heart ached at his words. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, but the walls she had built around her heart didn't crumble so easily. "Starting over isn't as simple as just saying it, Alexander. There's so much between us, good and bad, and I'm not sure if I'm ready to go through it all again." "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul, no matter how long it takes." For a moment they sat in silence, watching the children play. One little boy ran past them, chasing a ball, his laughter echoing through the park. Valerie couldn't help but think of her son and what his future might look like. Could Alexander truly be the father he needed? Could they navigate their shared past to create something better for him? Finally, Valerie broke the silence. "I'll give you the chance you're asking for, Alexander, but understand this. It's not just about you proving yourself to me. It's about showing me every day that you're ready to be the father our son deserves." Alexander nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his face. "I will, Valerie, every single day." As they stood to leave, the tension between them felt slightly lighter, though far from resolved. It was a start, a fragile, tentative step towards something new. Both of them knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time, they were willing to walk it together. The days that followed their conversation at the park were filled with cautious optimism, at least on Alexander's part. He texted Valerie daily, short and thoughtful messages that weren't intrusive, but showed he was present. "How are you feeling today?" Or, "Let me know if you need anything." It wasn't much, but he hoped these gestures would start to rebuild the bridge between them. Valerie read his messages with mixed emotions. She appreciated the effort, but a voice in the back of her mind kept questioning his intentions. Was this just guilt driving him? Would he stay consistent, or would he eventually slip back into the Alexander who had once prioritized his career over everything else? Sebastian, her closest confidant and the man who had been her rock during her pregnancy, noticed the change in her demeanor. One evening, as she sat at the dining table in her small apartment, scrolling through Alexander's latest message, Sebastian placed a cup of tea in front of her and took a seat across the table. "You've been quieter than usual," he said, his tone gentle but probing. "Is it because of him?" Valerie hesitated, but there was no point in denying it. "I don't know what to think, Sebastian. He says all the right things, but what if this is temporary? What if he's only doing this because he feels guilty?" Sebastian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms thoughtfully. "It's possible, but it's also possible that he's changed. People can surprise you, Val. The question is, do you want to take the risk?" Valerie looked down at her cup, the steam curling into the air. "It's not just me I'm thinking about. It's my son. I can't let him get hurt." "And that's why you're cautious," Sebastian replied. "But maybe you don't have to decide everything right now. Take it one step at a time. See if his actions match his words. The next day, Alexander asked Valerie to join him for lunch at a small family-owned restaurant he had discovered. She agreed, curious but still guarded. When she arrived, Alexander was already there, waiting outside to greet her. He smiled as she approached, opening the door for her. The restaurant was cozy, with wooden tables and the warm scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. It was a far cry from the high-end places Alexander had frequented in the past, and Valerie couldn't help but notice the effort he was making to create a more relaxed, approachable atmosphere. As they ate, their conversation gradually moved from surface-level topics to deeper, more personal ones. Alexander spoke about how his perspective had shifted over the past year, how he had come to realize the emptiness of his success without meaningful connections. Valerie listened, still skeptical but intrigued by his vulnerability. At one point, Alexander reached into his bag and pulled out a small journal. "I've been keeping this," he said, sliding it across the table to her. Valerie opened it hesitantly, flipping through pages filled with notes, sketches, and lists. There were entries about parenting tips, ideas for baby names, and even plans for creating a nursery. She paused on a page where he had written, "How to earn trust, day by day." "You've been planning all of this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I wanted to be ready," he admitted. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to be prepared for the future. For him. For us." Valerie closed the journal and looked at him, her expression softening despite herself. "It's a good start, Alexander, but there's still a long way to go." "I know," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm ready for it." As they left the restaurant, walking side by side, Valerie felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there, and for now that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Alexander's determination didn't waver. He showed up, not just physically, but emotionally, in ways that surprised Valerie. He attended her doctor's appointments, asked thoughtful questions, and made an effort to educate himself about the stages of pregnancy. Yet, while Valerie appreciated his efforts, the walls she had built over the years remained firmly in place, protecting her from the risk of being hurt again. One morning, Alexander texted Valerie with an invitation. "There's a local fair in the park this weekend. It might be nice to get some fresh air. I'll be there if you want to join." She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she was ready to spend time with him in such a casual public setting. But then, something about his tone, a mix of hope and respect for her boundaries, made her decide to give it a chance. "I'll think about it," she replied. When Saturday arrived, Valerie found herself walking toward the park, a sense of curiosity pushing her forward. The fair was lively, filled with the laughter of children and the aroma of food from various stalls. She spotted Alexander standing near a booth selling handcrafted wooden toys. He looked different from the polished businessman she remembered. Dressed in jeans and a simple shirt, he seemed more grounded, more approachable. He noticed her almost immediately, his face lighting up with a genuine smile. "You came," he said, his voice warm. "I did," she replied, her tone softer than she expected. It seemed like a nice day for a walk. They strolled through the fair together, stopping occasionally at different booths. Alexander was careful not to push, letting their conversation flow naturally. He asked about her favorite childhood memories, shared a few of his own, and even joked about his lack of artistic skills when they passed a painting station for kids. At one point, they came across a stall selling wooden toys. Alexander picked up a small, intricately carved elephant and turned to Valerie. "Do you think he'd like this?" he asked, referring to their unborn son. Valerie studied the toy, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood. "It's simple, but thoughtful," she said. "I think he might." Alexander handed some cash to the vendor and placed the toy in a small bag. "Then it's his first gift from me." The gesture was small but meaningful, and Valerie couldn't help but feel a slight crack in the walls she had built around her heart. As they continued walking, she found herself relaxing, even laughing at some of Alexander's attempts to win a stuffed animal at a ring toss game. But the moment of levity didn't erase her underlying fears. As the fair began to wind down, she turned to Alexander, her expression more serious. You're doing a lot, Alexander, and I appreciate it, I really do. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about showing up now. Being a father, being part of my life, it's a long-term commitment, and I need to know you're ready for that. Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. I know, Valerie, and I'm not just here for the good moments. I'm here for all of it. The hard days, the sleepless nights, everything. I'm not going anywhere. His words carried a weight that Valerie couldn't ignore. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of belief that maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. But she knew it would take more than words to convince her completely. As they said goodbye that evening, Alexander handed her the bag with the wooden elephant. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I'll prove to you that I'm here to stay." Valerie took the bag, her fingers lingering on the handle. "I hope you do, Alexander, because I won't let anyone hurt my son." The following week, Valerie found herself replaying moments from the fair in her mind. Alexander's gestures, his words, and the quiet determination in his eyes had left an impression she couldn't ignore. Yet, she reminded herself, impressions weren't enough. Trust wasn't something she could grant lightly, not when her son's future was at stake. One evening, as Valerie sat in her apartment organizing baby clothes gifted by friends, she received a text from Alexander. "I've been looking at cribs online. Do you have a preference? Maybe we can pick one together." She hesitated before responding. The idea of choosing something so personal with him felt intimate, almost like stepping into territory she wasn't ready to revisit. But after a moment of contemplation, she replied, "I haven't thought about it much. Send me what you found." Minutes later, her phone buzzed with a series of links. Alexander's choices ranged from sleek, minimalist designs to cozy, traditional ones. Valerie clicked through each option, surprised by the care he'd put into selecting items that balanced practicality with charm. The next day, Alexander followed up with an unexpected suggestion. "Would you like to visit a baby store together this weekend? Seeing things in person might help us decide." Again, Valerie wrestled with her instinct to keep her distance, but deep down she knew that part of rebuilding their connection meant allowing him to participate in these moments. "Okay," she finally responded. "Saturday morning." When Saturday arrived, they met outside a boutique baby store in the heart of the city. Alexander greeted her with a warm smile, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you might need this," he said, handing one to her. "Thanks," she replied, trying not to read too much into the gesture. Inside the store, they were surrounded by pastel-colored onesies, plush toys, and rows of baby furniture. Alexander approached the experience with a level of enthusiasm that caught Valerie off guard. He asked the store clerk detailed questions about safety features and durability, taking notes on his phone as they moved from one section to another. When they reached the cribs, Alexander paused in front of one in particular. It was simple, crafted from light wood with soft, rounded edges. "What do you think of this one?" he asked, glancing at her. Valerie ran her fingers along the smooth surface, imagining their son sleeping peacefully inside. "It's nice," she admitted. "It feels warm." Alexander smiled. "Then this is the one." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. Valerie felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, an inkling of trust, fragile but real. "You're really trying," she said softly. "I am," Alexander replied, "and I know I have a long way to go. But I'm not giving up." Later, as they left the store, Valerie turned to him. "Alexander, I appreciate everything you're doing, but I need to say this. I still have doubts. This isn't just about showing up now. It's about being consistent, about staying." Alexander met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I understand, Valerie, and I'll keep showing you that I'm here for the long haul." That night, as Valerie placed the store receipt for the crib in a drawer, she allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Alexander was proving himself in ways she hadn't expected, but she knew it would take time to fully trust him. Still, for the first time, the possibility of building a future together didn't feel so impossible. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act. Alexander continued to prove himself in small but meaningful ways, whether it was attending Valerie's doctor's appointments, researching parenting tips, or simply checking in on her well-being. Valerie appreciated his efforts, but she couldn't shake the weight of their history. Trust was still something she held tightly, unwilling to give freely. One evening, Alexander invited Valerie to dinner at a small, intimate restaurant he had discovered. "It's not fancy," he had said over the phone. "Just a quiet place where we can talk." When Valerie arrived, Alexander was already seated at a corner table, his posture relaxed, but his expression tinged with anticipation. He stood as she approached, pulling out her chair for her. "Thanks for coming," he said, his tone sincere. The restaurant was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and the faint hum of a piano in the background. As they browsed the menu, their conversation started light, touching on mundane topics like work and daily routines. But as the evening progressed, Alexander shifted the focus to what was truly on his mind. "Valerie," he began, his voice steady but vulnerable. "I know I've said it before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry. For everything. For the ways I hurt you. For the times I let my ambition come before you. I see now how much I lost because of it." Valerie set down her fork, meeting his gaze. "I appreciate the apology, Alexander, but words aren't enough to erase what happened. You have to understand how much it affected me." "I do," he said quickly, leaning forward slightly. "And I don't expect forgiveness overnight, but I want you to know that I've been working on myself. Not just for you or for our son, but because I needed to. I needed to be better." There was a long pause as Valerie considered his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, to accept the sincerity in his tone. But another part of her, the part that had spent years building walls around her heart, resisted. "Do you really think you've changed?" she asked softly. "Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" Alexander took a deep breath, his expression earnest. "I've changed, Valerie. I can't prove it with words alone. But I hope my actions over the past few weeks have shown you that I'm serious. I want to be here, not just for our son, but for you." Valerie looked away for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again loomed large. "It's going to take time," she said finally, "and I need you to be patient with me, because I'm still scared, Alexander, scared that this won't last." "I understand," he said, his voice firm, "and I'll be patient. I'll wait as long as it takes." The rest of the evening passed in a quieter, more reflective tone. By the time they left the restaurant, the air between them felt lighter, as if a small part of the distance that had once separated them had been bridged. When Valerie returned to her apartment that night, she sat by the window looking out at the city lights. Alexander's words echoed in her mind, stirring emotions she had tried to suppress. She wasn't ready to let her guard down completely, but for the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward. The following days were marked by small, meaningful steps. Alexander continued to show up, not just with words, but with actions that spoke louder. He accompanied Valerie to prenatal classes, taking notes diligently and asking thoughtful questions. When she mentioned craving a specific dish from a local cafe, he showed up with it the next day, unprompted. These gestures didn't erase the past, but they added layers of trust that Valerie hadn't expected to rebuild so quickly. One afternoon, as they sat together in a quiet park after a prenatal session, Valerie found herself watching Alexander interact with a group of children playing nearby. A little girl, no older than 5, had accidentally kicked her ball toward their bench. Alexander picked it up and handed it back to her with a smile, exchanging a few playful words that made the girl giggle before she ran back to her friends. It was such a simple moment, but it stirred something deep within Valerie, a glimpse of the father he might become. "You're good with kids," she said, breaking the silence. Alexander turned to her, a faint smile on his lips. "I hope to be good with ours," he replied softly. Valerie looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. The walls she had spent years building felt fragile in moments like these, as if they might crumble under the weight of hope. Later that evening, as Valerie prepared dinner in her apartment, her closest friend, Julia, dropped by unannounced. Julia had been a constant presence in Valerie's life, offering support and advice throughout her pregnancy. As they sat together, Julia noticed the shift in Valerie's demeanor. "You seem different," Julia said, eyeing her friend curiously. "Is it because of Alexander?" Valerie hesitated before answering. "He's been trying, showing up, doing all the things I never thought he'd do." "And how does that make you feel?" Julia asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Conflicted," Valerie admitted. "Part of me wants to believe he's changed, that he really means it this time, but another part of me is terrified of getting hurt again." Julia reached out, placing a hand over Valerie's. "You don't have to decide everything right now. Take it one day at a time. Let his actions speak for themselves." Valerie nodded, grateful for her friend's perspective. Deep down, she knew Julia was right. The journey she and Alexander were on was still unfolding, and rushing into anything would only add unnecessary pressure. The next day, Alexander surprised Valerie by suggesting they visit a nearby botanical garden. "It's a peaceful place," he explained. "I thought it might be nice to walk around and talk." As they strolled through the lush greenery, Valerie couldn't help but notice how attentive Alexander was, not just to her, but to everything around them. He pointed out flowers she might like, offered to carry her bag, and adjusted his pace to match hers. It was a far cry from the man she remembered, whose focus had always been on himself and his goals. "I've been thinking about what you said," Alexander began, breaking the comfortable silence. "About consistency, about proving myself. And I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul, not just for you, but for our son." Valerie paused, turning to face him. "I can see you're trying, Alexander, and I appreciate it more than I can say. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about showing up now, it's about staying." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "And I will. Whatever it takes, Valerie." For the first time, she allowed herself to smile, a small but genuine expression of hope. "Let's take it one day at a time," she said. "One day at a time," Alexander repeated, as if sealing a promise between them. As they continued their walk, Valerie felt the weight of her fears lighten just a little. Trust was still a fragile thing, but it was growing, slowly, steadily, and perhaps strong enough to hold the pieces of their future together. Despite the progress they were making, the shadows of the past continued to linger. Valerie found herself overthinking the moments she shared with Alexander, questioning whether his efforts were genuine or if they would fade once the novelty of fatherhood wore off. She couldn't afford to let herself be blindsided again, not with her son's future at stake. One evening, as Valerie sat on her couch folding baby clothes, her phone buzzed with a call. She glanced at the screen. Alexander. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Hey," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral. "Hi," Alexander replied, his voice warm. "I was just checking in. How are you feeling today?" "I'm okay," she said, though her tone betrayed the heaviness she was carrying. "Just tired, I guess." Alexander paused, picking up on the subtle shift in her mood. "Is there something on your mind?" Valerie hesitated. She had promised herself she wouldn't let her doubts spill over into their fragile truce, but the words tumbled out before she could stop them. "Do you ever think about what happens if this doesn't work? If you decide this is too much?" "Valerie," Alexander said gently, "I'm not going anywhere. I meant it when I said I'm committed, to you and to our son." "But people change their minds," she countered, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "What if one day you wake up and realize this isn't the life you want?" "I can't guarantee the future," he admitted, his tone honest. "But I can promise you this, I'm here now, and I'm not making decisions based on fear or obligation. I'm here because I want to be." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Valerie wanted to believe him, but the scars of their past made it hard. I don't know if I can trust that yet," she said quietly. "And that's okay," Alexander replied. "I'm not asking you to trust me overnight, but I'll keep showing up, Valerie, every day, for as long as it takes." The conversation stayed with Valerie long after they hung up. She replayed his words in her mind, wondering if it was possible to truly let go of her fears and give him the chance he was asking for. The next day, Alexander invited Valerie to a dinner at his apartment. "Nothing fancy," he had said, "just a home-cooked meal. I want to show you a piece of the life I'm building. For us." When she arrived, she was surprised by how different his apartment felt. Gone were the cold minimalist furnishings she remembered from years ago. Instead, the space felt warmer, more lived in. Books lined the shelves, family photos hung on the walls, and the aroma of something delicious filled the air. "I didn't realize you could cook," Valerie teased as Alexander greeted her. I didn't either, he admitted with a laugh. But I've been practicing. Tonight, you're my test subject. As they sat down to eat, Valerie couldn't help but notice the effort Alexander had put into the evening. The meal, though simple, was thoughtful, and the conversation flowed naturally. For a moment, it felt as though they were rediscovering each other, not as the people they used to be, but as who they were now. After dinner, Alexander showed her a small corner of the apartment he had started to set up as a nursery. "It's a work in progress," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I wanted to make sure there was space for him here." Valerie stood in the doorway, taking in the small crib, the shelves lined with picture books, and the soft blue paint on the walls. It was far from complete, but it was a start. "You've been busy," she said, her voice softer now. "I wanted to be ready," Alexander said simply. As she left his apartment that night, Valerie felt the tiniest flicker of hope growing in her chest. She wasn't ready to let down all her walls, but for the first time, she could see a future where they might find their way back to each other. The weeks continued to pass, each one marked by moments that slowly began to chip away at Valerie's guarded heart. Alexander's presence was steady, his actions consistent, and his promises no longer felt like empty words. Yet, even as she began to trust him more, the fear of being let down lingered like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. One afternoon, Valerie sat at a local cafe, a notebook open in front of her. She had been making a list of things to prepare before the baby arrived, but found her thoughts drifting to Alexander instead. The way he had transformed his apartment to make room for their son. The patience he showed during her moments of doubt, the vulnerability in his voice when he spoke about wanting to do better, all of it weighed on her mind. Before she could sink too deeply into her thoughts, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Alexander. "I was wondering if you're free this evening. I have something I want to show you." Her first instinct was to hesitate, but curiosity won out. "Okay, what time?" she replied. That evening, Alexander picked her up, his demeanor calm but tinged with a nervous energy. He didn't tell her where they were going, only saying, "It's something important." They drove in silence, the city lights casting a warm glow over the streets as they headed toward their destination. When they arrived, Valerie realized they were at a community center. Alexander led her inside, where a small group of people was gathered in a circle, engaged in quiet conversation. She looked at him confused. "What is this?" "It's a support group," he explained, "for new and expecting fathers. I've been coming here for a while now." Valerie blinked, taken aback. "You've been doing this army on your own?" "I wanted to be better," Alexander said simply. "I knew I couldn't just promise you I'd change. I needed to take real steps to make sure I could be the father our son deserves. These meetings have helped me understand what that looks like." For a moment, Valerie didn't know what to say. The vulnerability in his admission was raw and unfiltered, and it touched her in a way she hadn't expected. "Why didn't you tell me before?" she asked softly. "I wanted to wait until I could show you that I was serious," he replied. "This isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about being the kind of person who can show up for you and our son every day." They stayed for the rest of the session, Valerie sitting quietly as Alexander participated. She listened as he shared his fears about fatherhood, his regrets about the mistakes he had made in the past, and his determination to do better. It was the most honest she had ever seen him, and it left her both moved and unsettled. As they drove back to her apartment, the silence between them felt heavier, but not uncomfortable. When they arrived, Valerie turned to him before getting out of the car. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "For showing me this, it means a lot." Alexander nodded, his expression serious. "I meant what I said, Valerie. I'm in this for the long haul, whatever it takes." That night, as Valerie lay in bed, she replayed everything she had seen and heard. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where they could co-parent, where their son could grow up with both of them present. It wasn't an easy thought to hold on to. Her fears and doubts still clung to her, but it felt more possible than it ever had before. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Valerie's apartment, casting a soft glow on her living room. She sat on the couch, sipping a cup of tea, her thoughts far away. The memory of the support group lingered in her mind, mingling with the countless moments Alexander had shown her, a version of himself she hadn't thought possible. There was still a part of her that hesitated, but another part, a quieter, hopeful part, was beginning to take root. She had spent so much time guarding herself against disappointment that allowing even the smallest amount of hope felt like an act of courage. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Alexander. "Good morning, I was thinking, would you like to spend some time together today? No pressure, maybe a walk or lunch?" She hesitated for a moment before typing back, "Lunch sounds good. You choose the place." A few hours later, they met at a small family-run diner on the outskirts of the city. The atmosphere was warm and inviting, with the scent of freshly baked pies filling the air. Alexander was already seated when she arrived, and he stood to greet her with a smile. "This place is cozy," Valerie remarked, as she slid into the booth across from him. "I thought you'd like it," Alexander replied, "and their pie is supposed to be amazing." They ordered their meals and the conversation flowed easily. For once it wasn't weighed down by the past or their fears. They talked about names for the baby, shared childhood memories, and even joked about Alexander's questionable cooking skills. When their food arrived, Valerie noticed Alexander watching her, his expression soft but serious. "What?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "I'm just grateful," he said, "for this, for the chance to be here with you." Valerie felt her cheeks warm, and she looked down at her plate to hide her smile. "I'm grateful too," she admitted quietly. "I didn't think we'd ever get to a place like this." After lunch, they decided to take a walk along a nearby trail. The crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath their feet created a sense of peace that Valerie hadn't felt in a long time. As they walked, Alexander reached out and gently took her hand. She glanced at him, surprised, but didn't pull away. "Valerie," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I know we still have a long way to go. But I want you to know that I'm not just here for our son. I'm here for you too. I still care about you, more than I can put into words." Her breath caught at his words, and she stopped walking, turning to face him. "Alexander, this hasn't been easy for me. Trusting you again, letting you back into my life, it's terrifying. But I see the effort you're making, and it means more than you know." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. All I want is the chance to prove that we can build something better this time. For our son. For us." For a long moment, Valerie didn't speak. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said softly. "That's all I can promise right now." "That's more than enough," Alexander replied, his voice filled with quiet relief. As they continued walking, hand in hand, Valerie felt something shift inside her. The walls she had built over the years weren't gone, but they were beginning to crack, allowing the possibility of a new beginning to shine through. That night, as she lay in bed, Valerie thought about the road ahead. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she felt ready to take the journey, one step at a time. Sometimes the greatest challenges in life are not the ones we face in the world, but the ones we face within ourselves. Valerie and Alexander's story reminds us that healing and trust take time. But with effort and love, even the deepest wounds can lead to new beginnings. What would you have done in Valerie's shoes? Do you believe in second chances? Share your thoughts in the comments below and don't miss the next heartwarming story waiting for you. Click now to discover a new tale of love and redemption.